The first time I saw her, she was walking out of smoke, stumbling, half burned, clutching a ledger to her chest like it was the last piece of her she could still hold on to. The sky behind her glowed red with the remains of a wagon fire, and the wind carried the kind of silence that follows after men with guns leave the scene. I remember thinking she looked like someone who'd been running so long. She'd forgotten how to stand still, and maybe forgotten why she should. But when she saw me, she didn't beg for water, or help, or mercy. She whispered, "Please, I can work." That was the moment I knew, whatever story brought her, there wasn't just dangerous. It was breaking her from the inside out. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. The sun was sinking low when Callum Hayes spotted the first thread of smoke rising over Cinder Ridge. It was thin at first, just a faint, wavering line against the wide Wyoming sky, the kind of smoke a rancher might make warming his supper. But the color was wrong, too dark, too heavy. It clung to the air the way blood clings to a shirt. Callum eased his bay gelding to a slow walk. The horse tossed its head, uneasy, catching the scent long before he did. When the wind shifted, the truth rode right into Callum's lungs, burned canvas, scorched wood, and something sharper underneath. Gunpowder, recent. He tightened his reins. Nothing good ever burned on the open flats, west of Broken Mesa. The land stretched quiet around him, a sea of sagebrush and dry grass, flickering gold in the dying light. Cinder Ridge rose like a barren scar, a long hump of rock and shale worn down by time and storms. No ranches out that way, no camps, no reason at all for a fire. Callum nudged his horse forward. He'd been a Texas Ranger once, years and miles away. He'd left that life behind, or tried to. But trouble had a scent a man never forgot. As he rode closer, the air thickened. The smoke curled low across the ground, like it didn't want to rise, like it meant to stay close to death. 50 yards out, Callum swung out of the saddle and led the horse the rest of the way. The earth was hot to the touch, and the fire still crunched under his boots. What used to be a small freight wagon lay half collapsed near a dry wash. Iron rims twisted, one wheel blown clean apart. The axles were black bones now. Torn sacks, spilled flour into the dirt, turning to paste where stray embers fell. A barrel of something once useful lay cracked open, contents leaking into the dust. Callum crouched, fingers brushing the ground. Tracks everywhere too many to count. Hooves, boots. The drag marks of something heavy pulled away. Shell casings glinted like little teeth. Someone had fired a lot of shots here, and not long ago. He found one body near the wagon tongue. A man in a work shirt, face down, arms sprawled as though he'd tried to crawl. No gun on him. No chance he'd ever needed one. Callum stood slowly. He hated the silence most of all. It wasn't natural. Not after gunfire. Not after death. The prairie should have held echoes, but the world felt muted, as though someone had pressed a hand over its mouth. He checked the dust for signs of survivors. Footprints scattered, some lighter, some desperate, one set smaller. Narrower woman's shoes. Maybe. They staggered, veered, doubled back, then disappeared into a trail of soot. A soft sound drifted on the wind. He froze. Not the scream of an injured man. Not a shout. Not even a cry. It was a breath. A thin, ragged breath. Callum turned toward the burnt shell of the wagon. At first he saw nothing but smoke and the glow of dying coals. Then something moved. Just a shift. Like a shadow detaching itself from the wreck. A figure stepped out slow. wavering, half made of smoke and half of stubborn will. She was a woman, dress torn nearly to ribbons, hair matted with ash. Her face streaked black, except where tears had carved clean lines down her cheeks. She held something tight to her chest, a small ledger book. Corners singed but clutched, as though it were life itself. She swayed. Her boots scraped the dirt. Callum raised a hand. Palm out. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, easy now. Her eyes darted toward him wide, untrusting, wild in the way of someone who'd run far past the edge of her fear. She stood straighter, though her body trembled like a fence rail in storm wind. When she spoke, her voice cracked, but she tried to make it steady. Tried to sound like a woman at a storefront counter, not a soul walking out of fire. "Sir, I can work," she said. "I can cook, sew, keep accounts. Just don't leave me here." That last word broke. Here wasn't the earth beneath them, it was whatever horror still clung to her memory. Callum stepped forward, hands open. "You're hurt. No one's leaving you anywhere." She tried to argue, tried to straighten her spine again, but her knees buckled. The ledger slipped from her fingers. She didn't fall. Quietly, she crumpled, the way a structure gives out once the last beam snaps. Callum lunged, catching her before she struck the ground. Her head fell against his shoulder. Breath shallow, hot with fever or shock, he couldn't tell which. The world around them glowed a deep, angry red as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Smoke curled upward like the last whisper of something wicked slinking away. Callum looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms, a stranger, a survivor, someone whose life had cracked open on a lonely patch of Wyoming dirt. He didn't know her story, he didn't know her name, but he knew the look of a soul who'd run out of road. His horse stamped nervously behind him. Callum adjusted his grip, lifted her lightly as though she weighed nothing more than a memory, and headed for the saddle. The smoke drifted across the ridge, swallowing the last of the daylight. Behind him, the west burned orange and red. Ahead of him, trouble rode with every step, and in his arms, a woman who'd begged to work was slipping into darkness, still holding on to the last thing she owned, fear. He shifted her weight, breathing out into the cold. "Rest now," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. Wind rolled across the flats, whispering the first hint of what lay ahead, but the night kept its secrets close, for now. The cabin creaked softly when the wind pushed against its cedar boards. The kind of old, familiar sound a man stopped noticing after years of hearing it. But to Eve Mercer, waking from a darkness thick as tar, the creak felt like the world turning on a rusty hinge. It tugged her back to the surface of herself. The first thing she smelled was coffee, strong, bitter, and fresh. The second was smoke from a cast-iron stove, the kind that burned slow and steady. The third was leather oil, faint but comforting, like the memory of a saddle warmed by the sun. Her eyes fluttered open to a dim room. A ticking wall clock marked the seconds with patient insistence. A battered Bible lay on a shelf near the window, its spine bent from long use. Across from her, against the table, sat a second chair empty, its seat layered with dust as though no one had touched it in years. She didn't know where she was, and that terrified her before the thought even finished forming. Eve tried sitting up, but the room lurched sideways, and she had to brace a hand against the quilt beneath her. Her breath came sharp and fast. Sweat dampened her temples. She remembered flames, the wagon, the gunshots, then hands lifting her, A low voice saying something she couldn't hold on to. A metallic clang echoed from outside, measured, steady, shaped by a practiced rhythm. She recognized the sound distantly, a small anvil, maybe a horseshoe hammering. Whoever owned this place worked early. The door eased open. Boots scuffed the floor once, twice. A shadow filled the doorway, tall and quiet. Callum Hayes stepped inside, carrying a tin mug. Steam curled from its rim, trailing behind him like a small ghost. "You're awake," he said. His voice was gravel-soft, shaped by solitude more than age. He handed her the mug. She reached with both hands because one alone wasn't steady enough. The warmth seeped into her palms, grounding her. "You're at my cabin," he added. "Hayes Ranch, about 8 miles west of Broken Mesa." Eve looked down at the quilt, noting the stitching, long, careful lines done by a hand that worked slow, not perfect, but patient. She sat in a narrow cot near the stove. Beyond it, a tiny room stretched only far enough for a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of jars, and a line of hooks where Callum hung his coats. "Why? Why did you bring me here?" she asked. "You were alive," he said simply. "Didn't seem right leaving you out there." He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe. No looming, no threats. Just a man watching her with the same calm he might give a spooked horse, alert, gentle, not overly close. "I'm Callum Hayes," he said. "Used to ride with the Rangers long time ago. Now I raise horses, fix what needs fixin', keep to myself mostly. That's the shape of me." Eve clutched the ledger book, lying beside her on the cot. Its edges were charred, but it had survived. So had she. Barely. Callum nodded toward it. "What's your name?" "Ma'am." Her fingers tightened. Her throat worked. "Eveline Mercer," she whispered. "Folks called me Eve, or accountant, or just girl. Total this." She let out a breath that trembled at the end. "I suppose it doesn't matter much anymore." Callum didn't argue with her, but something softened in his eyes. A brief flicker of understanding. "I found you near a burned freight wagon," he said. "Tracks all around it. Didn't see anyone else." Her heart lurched. Panic licked up her spine like a cold flame. She looked around suddenly. The neat tack hung on the wall. The table stacked with split wood. The tidy boots by the door. Everything in the room said one thing very clearly. He lived alone. Alone meant no witnesses. Alone meant no one to stop him from sending her right back out into the wild. She felt the old instinct rise, fear disguised as usefulness. "I can work," she blurted. "Cook, clean, sew. I can keep your accounts if you have any. I can help with the horses if you show me how. I won't be a burden." Callum blinked once, slow. "No one said you were. I can pay you back," she insisted, words tumbling fast. "Whatever this costs food, the room, the trouble, I'll earn it." "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly. "You can't even sit up without swaying." His voice wasn't harsh, just matter of fact, like stating the weather. "Work comes later," he added, "if at all." That last part struck her like a blow. If at all. If she was too broken to be useful. What then would she be turned out? Left somewhere on the road? The mug rattled in her hands. Callum noticed. He stepped forward, not abruptly, but with the steady patience of someone approaching a wounded animal. "You're safe here," he said. "There's no ledger owed. You heal first." She shook her head. "I can't stay here for nothing." "Not nothing," he answered. "You're breathing. That's enough." But Eve didn't believe him. Not fully. Not yet. She pushed the blanket aside and swung her feet to the floor. The boards were cold. Her legs wobbled. Still, she lifted her chin, determined to stand. Callum's jaw tightened. Don't, I need to show you, she insisted. I'm worth keeping. She tried to rise, and the world reeled. Her knees buckled. The mug slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. She grabbed the table edge, but her hands weren't strong enough. The room dimmed around the edges, around. Callum reached her, just as she tipped sideways. His arms came around her back, steady, firm, smelling faintly of horses and prairie dust. Easy, he murmured. Easy now. Her head fell against his chest. She heard his heartbeat slow, steady, the rhythm of a man who didn't startle easily. Or maybe he'd just learned long ago that panic never saved anyone. He guided her back onto the cot, pulling the quilt up around her shoulders. You're allowed to be tired here, Ma'am? He said it barely above a whisper. Half to her, half to the empty chair across the room, a confession disguised as comfort. Eve closed her eyes. The words settled over her like warm ash. She wanted to believe him. God help her, she wanted to. But hope was a dangerous thing in a land where everything had a price. She lay there listening to the wind scratch against the cabin walls, wondering what it would cost her to stay and whether she had anything left to offer. The clock ticked on, and outside, the hammering from Callum's smithing shed began again, slow and sure, like a heartbeat in the cold. A week after the smoke on Cinder Ridge, Eve Mercer was well enough to sit on the wagon bench, though Callum still tied the reins tight, so the horses wouldn't jolt too hard. The morning sun had only just cleared the cottonwoods, brushing the frost off the grass in faint gold streaks. Callum gave her a little nod. You sure you're up for the ride? Eve pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her cheeks were pale, her breath thin, but her eyes held a steadiness she seemed to borrow from the land itself. I need to see a doctor, she said quietly. And I want to pay for the supplies you've used on me. Callum didn't comment on that last part. He only clicked his tongue and urged the horses forward. The wheels creaked as they rolled down the narrow road toward Broken Mesa. Sagebrush bent in the wind. Dust rose behind them in a long, uncertain trail. For a while, they rode in silence. Eve held the ledger book on her lap, thumb tracing its blackened edge. She didn't open it. Finally, Callum asked, You remember anything else? From the night I found you, Eve hesitated. Her voice came out small. Everything and nothing. Another mile passed before she continued, speaking in fragments, as though each piece cost her something. I kept the books for Copper Star Mining Company. In Red Bluff. Her knuckles tightened around the ledger. I balanced wages, tallied store credit, logged water usage. It all seemed routine. She swallowed, until it didn't. Callum watched the road, but listened with the focus of a man who'd learned long ago when not to interrupt. They were bleeding the miners dry, she said, charging them twice for goods, falsifying their overtime, selling water that wasn't clean. She shook her head. Children got sick, livestock died, people whispered, but no one had proof. So you made some, Callum said quietly. Eve nodded. I copied their real ledgers, hid them. I was careful, but not careful enough. A foreman saw me working late one night. He said I knew too much. Said accidents happen in mining towns. She paused. I left before they could decide what kind of accident they meant. The wagon hit a small rut, jostling her. She winced. Callum's jaw locked. You should have told me sooner. I didn't know if I could trust you, she whispered. He didn't take offense. That's fair. Broken Mesa appeared slowly over the last rise, a scattering of wooden storefronts, hitching posts. and wagons gathered like a shaky ring around a single, dusty street. Smoke curled from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere near the feed store. The place looked peaceful, but something in the air felt stretched thin, as though the town held its breath. Callum pulled up near Riley's forge, where iron rang like sharp thunder against the anvil. Sparks flew in bright arcs as Riley Dunn lifted his hammer again and again. He paused only when he saw Callum step down. "Well, I'll be damned," Riley said, wiping his brow. "Didn't expect you to come in before next month." Callum jerked his chin toward Eve. "Got someone needs a doctor." Riley's eyes softened. "Rough trail for her." "I reckon." Eve tried to smile, but her fingers dug into the ledger on her lap. They left the wagon near the forge and walked toward Dr. Whitlow's office. Passing the Dust Lantern Saloon, where an out-of-tune piano plinked through a half-hearted melody. Men leaned in the doorway, hats low, cigarettes glowing. One of them straightened when he saw Eve. His gaze slid over her, like a knife testing for soft places. Callum stepped subtly in front of her, blocking his line of sight. Eve's breath hitched. "Someone from Copper Star," she whispered. "Maybe," Callum said. "Maybe not. Either way, keep close." At St. Agnes Chapel, the bell rope swayed lightly in the wind. A few women swept the steps, pausing to glance at Eve with the kind of quick curiosity small towns lived on. Two soldiers in blue uniforms lounged outside the general store. Rifles propped against the wall. Fort Kearney outpost wasn't far, its presence always lingered. Inside Dr. Whitlow's cramped office, Eve was checked for fever, bruises, and fractures. "You've been through hell," the doctor said, shaking his head. "You'll live, though. Rest. Food. A warm place. That's the recipe." Eve looked at Callum as though the words themselves were foreign. Rest. Warm place. She didn't know how long it had been since she'd had either without fear attached. When they returned to Riley's forge for the horses, the blacksmith leaned in close to Callum. His voice dropped to a gravel whisper. "Got word Copper Star's been nosing around Broken Mesa," Riley said. "Buying lawmen, buying bullets, from here to Fort Kearney." Callum's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. Riley tipped his head slightly toward Eve, who stood a few yards away, watching the street like someone expecting a blow. "That woman yours?" he asked. "No." "Then be careful," Riley warned. "If she's who I think she is, you're boarding trouble." Callum didn't look back at Eve. "She's under my roof," he said. "That's enough." They rode out of town just as the sky began to dim. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant rain. The horses moved steady along the ridge road. Eve held the ledger like a shield. "I didn't want to drag anyone else into this," she murmured. "Bit late for that." Callum replied. They were halfway between town and the ranch when it happened. A sharp crack split the air. The horses spooked sideways, snorting, hooves tearing at the dirt. Callum grabbed the reins hard. "Get down." Eve dropped to the floorboard of the wagon as another sound echoed a ricochet, snapping off the rocks above them. Not a hit, not aimed to kill. A warning. Callum scanned the ridge. The shooter was already gone. Dust settled slowly, like an accusation drifting down. Eve's voice shook. "They know where I am." Callum's answer was a low, steady rumble. "They do now." And the horses carried them into the lengthening dusk, leaving the silence behind to whisper all the threats the gunman hadn't needed to speak aloud. The morning after the shot on the ridge, Eve rose before the sun. Callum didn't hear her at first, just the soft scrape of a chair, the rustle of fabric, the dull thump of boots placed gently on the floor. By the time he stepped out of his room, she was already in the kitchen, peeling potatoes with a focus that felt too sharp for so early an hour. "You don't have to do that," Callum said, voice still rough with sleep. Eve didn't look up. "It needs doing." Her hands moved fast, almost frantic. Potato skins curled in pale ribbons across the table. Her fingers were stiff, still tender from burns and bruises, but she acted as though she didn't notice the sting. Callum watched her for a moment, leaning against the doorway. Something about the way she worked shoulders tight, breath shallow, gave him the uneasy sense she wasn't cooking. She was fighting something off. By the time he stepped outside to tend the horses, she had swept the floors. By midday, she'd gathered his scattered receipts from the shelf, sorted them into tidy piles, and begun tallying figures with the small stub of a pencil she'd found. "Eve," Callum said, setting down his tools, "you should rest." She didn't answer. Eve, still nothing. He stepped closer. The pencil in her hand trembled slightly, though her knuckles were white with effort. She was adding numbers that didn't matter much. Grain sacks, shoeing fees, fence wire, purchased months ago. But she calculated each figure like a judge, weighing a man's life. Finally, she said, "Resting makes the mind louder." There was something in the way she said it flat, resigned, that told Callum she wasn't talking about bookkeeping anymore. The day sank into evening. A cold dusk settled over the ranch, turning the windows into smudged mirrors. Callum lit the oil lamp and set it on the table. Its glow softened the room, but sharpened the shadows on Eve's face. She sat rigidly, ledger open on her lap, fingers tracing columns of ink that shook beneath her touch. He pulled out a chair across from her. "You're not sleepin'. Not eatin' right either." "I'm fine," she murmured. "You're not—" Her eyes flickered up, just for a second. "If I keep busy, I don't fall apart." Callum didn't answer right away. Silence had always served him better than talk. He'd learned long ago that words, when spoken in pain, had to be handled slow, like a wounded horse. Eve breathed out shakily. "My whole life, the only thing I was ever good for was work. Numbers, columns, accuracy. People didn't ask how I was doing. They asked if the wages matched the hours, if the calculations were clean." She blinked rapidly. "When Copperstar wanted the books falsified and I refused, they didn't argue. They just called me ungrateful, lazy, hysterical." A bitter breath escaped her. "That last one they said most often." Callum folded his hands on the table. "Doesn't seem to me like you're any of those things." "That's kind of you," she said. "But kindness doesn't change what happened. They shoved me out the door, and when I left, there was nowhere else to go." She stared at her own handwriting in the ledger, though Callum doubted she was truly seeing it. "Everything I ever was," she whispered, "fit in those little boxes. Those lines." The pencil shook in her fingers. "If I'm not working, I don't know what's left of me." Callum looked toward the empty chair beside the stove, his father's chair, untouched since the old man died. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, filled with ghosts no one asked for. He spoke slowly, carefully. "You know, I walked away from work once too." Eve's eyes lifted. He hadn't intended to tell her. Hell, he hadn't told anyone in years. But the way she clutched her ledger, like a lifeline turned knife, made something old stir in him. "I rode with the Rangers after the war," he said. We were supposed to keep order. That's what they told us. But they left out what order meant. He rubbed a hand across the grain of the table. We moved folks off land they'd lived on their whole lives. Freedmen, poor farmers, people who didn't have the right papers or the right color skin. I followed orders because that's what soldiers do. Eve watched him with a stillness that was almost reverent, like no one had ever spoken to her this plainly. One winter, Callum continued, they sent us to a homestead near the Brazos. Family with 2 kids. The father was a veteran. Didn't matter. We were told to drag them out, torch the place if they fought. His jaw clenched. I got as far as the front step before something in me wouldn't move. "What did you do?" Eve whispered. I turned around. Callum exhaled, dropped my badge in the dirt and walked away. My captain called me a coward, a traitor, said I'd be hunted for desertion. His eyes darkened at the memory. But truth is, it's the orders I followed before that keep me up at night. Eve swallowed. You carry guilt. Every man who's done wrong does. Callum said, but guilt's only useful if it turns you into something better. For a long moment, they sat in the warm halo of lamplight, the quiet pressing soft around them. Outside, the horses shifted in their stalls. A coyote cried somewhere beyond the ridge. Eve's breath wavered. I followed orders too. She said, barely audible, signed numbers on a page I thought were harmless. I was just doing what I was told. That's what accountants do. We follow the math. She drew in a sharp breath. But the math hurt people, and I didn't see it until too late. Her hands finally stopped moving. If I stop working, she whispered, voice cracking clean through, I don't know who I am. The confession hung between them raw, stripped of defense, heavier than the ledger itself. Callum leaned back slowly, as though weighing her words with the same care she used on numbers. Maybe out here, he said, tone low and steady. You get to find out. Eve stared at him, the lamplight catching the shine in her eyes. She didn't answer, not with words. But something in her posture shifted, a looseness in her shoulders, a faint unguardedness. As though, for the first time in a long time, she was considering the possibility that there might be a version of herself not built on labor or debt. Outside, the wind rustled across the dry grass, carrying the faint smell of winter. Inside, the cabin held its breath quiet, waiting for whatever might come next. Winter settled early that year, quiet, certain, and colder than the ranch had seen in a long while. Frost glazed the water trough each dawn, thick enough that Callum had to break it twice just to let the horses drink. Breath rose white from every living thing, horses, cattle, even the old cedar cabin when its chimney puffed a tired plume into the sky. Eve felt the cold before she even opened her eyes each morning. It crept beneath the quilt, slipped under her collar, and found the ache in her bones that the doctor said would take time to heal. Time was something she wasn't good at taking, so she ignored it. Before the first hint of sunrise, she rose quietly, feet careful on the wooden floorboards so as not to wake Callum. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and moved through the cabin on habit lighting the stove, folding blankets, sweeping up what little dust had gathered, anything to feel useful. She pushed through a cough that had built slowly over the last few days, dull at first, then sharper, tugging at her ribs. The kind of cough a woman tried to hide behind a polite smile. She'd hidden worse things. By the time the horizon lightened, she was already outside, breath fogging in the cold. Snow clung to the corners of the corral, thin but threatening more. Her fingers stiffened around the pitchfork as she reached for the manure pile. She told herself she was strong enough. She'd always had to be. But as she stepped forward, the world tilted just a fraction, just long enough to unsettle her balance. Her grip slipped. The pitchfork dipped dangerously, the tines catching in loose straw. Her knees wobbled, the ground felt a half-inch too far from her boots. She didn't fall, because Callum caught the pitchfork mid-drop. He must have come out of the barn without her noticing. He stood close now, breath visible in the cold, eyes narrowed with quiet frustration. "You're still healing," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You don't owe me that." Eve straightened as best she could. The cold bit at her fingers, turning them stiff and red. "I can do it," she said. "It's just a little work. That little work is about to put you on your back. I'm fine. You're not." Something inside her sparked small, sharp, and frightened. "You don't understand," she snapped. "Everyone's ever told me I did owe them." Her voice rose, trembling. "Eat from their table. Work, sleep under their roof. Work, draw breath work." Callum didn't interrupt. He just listened, jaw clenched against whatever emotion tried to surface. Eve hugged her arms around herself, fighting the shiver that wasn't from the cold. "I can work," she whispered. "I can earn my keep. I'll do anything you ask, just don't send me away." Her voice broke on the last word. Callum set the pitchfork aside slowly, as though putting down something fragile. Then he stepped closer, close enough that Eve could see the lines carved at the corners of his eyes, the flecks of gray in his beard, the worry he never said aloud. "Eve," he said softly. She tried to look away, but his voice held her still. "Look at me." She did. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the horse shifting in the stall, the faint crack of ice on the trough, and the wind scraping across winter grass. Then Callum spoke a low, almost broken whisper, the kind a man didn't use unless it came from someplace deep. "No," he said. "You can rest beside me." Eve blinked. The words didn't make sense. Not in her world. Not in the life she'd lived. "No one rests for free," she whispered. "This ranch isn't a debtor's camp," Callum said. "You're not a hired hand on trial. You don't owe me labor, or gratitude, or explanations." His voice deepened. "You're a guest. For as long as you need." Eve's throat tightened, her breath hitched. She gripped the shawl around her shoulders like it was the only thing keeping her together. "But I'm not anything," she said. "I don't have money, or family, or a place to Eve." His tone was firm enough to stop her words in place. "You're alive," he said. "That's enough reason to stay." The wind stilled around them, as though even the prairie wanted to hear her answer. But Eve couldn't speak, couldn't breathe right, couldn't understand why a man who owed her nothing would offer something so impossible. Rest, safety, a place. She shook her head weakly. "I don't deserve, nobody's asking you to deserve anything," Callum said. Her eyes burned. She swallowed hard, but the emotion rose faster than she could push it down. She'd held herself together through fire and fear, raids and nights of running, through loss and humiliation. But this kindness, this undid her. Her shoulders sagged. The promise of warmth, of reprieve, cracked something in her ribcage. A long, shuddering breath escaped her. Callum didn't reach for her. He didn't try to pull her close or offer comfort she wasn't ready to take. He simply stood steady beside her, arms warm at his sides, presence heavy and solid, like the cedar beams that held the cabin up. And in that quiet, Eve understood something terrifying. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to rest, but she didn't know how. Her breath trembled again. Her knees softened, not from weakness, but from relief, so foreign it felt like falling. Callum stepped half an inch closer, not touching, just offering steady ground. "Let the work wait," he murmured. "Let yourself wait, just for a little while." Eve closed her eyes. The winter wind brushed her hair. The horses snorted softly. And somewhere, deep inside, a door she'd kept bolted for years loosened by a fraction. Just enough for the cold to seep out, just enough for warmth to seep in. She opened her eyes slowly, meeting Callum's steady gaze. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Callum nodded, as if he'd expected her answer. "That's all right," he said. "You're not alone in learnin'." The words hung there soft, uncertain, hopeful, and for the first time since he'd found her in the smoke, Eve didn't feel like a burden waiting to be measured. She felt like a person someone meant to keep. Snow came hard that night, thick flakes drifting sideways, driven by a wind that howled along the ridge like a wounded animal. By midnight, Hayes Ranch was nothing more than a dim outline under a white shroud. The fences vanished. The road vanished. Even the barn lantern blurred behind a curtain of drifting ice. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and hissed. Eve lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, flickering with lamplight shadows. She couldn't sleep. The cold had settled deep in her chest. Each breath felt thin, trembling. Callum had banked the stove and gone to bed hours earlier, but she heard him shift, sometimes light, restless movements of a man whose mind was never fully at ease. The wind rose again, rattling the shutters. Then something else joined it. A low growl. One of the ranch dogs. Eve stiffened, her pulse skipped. Another growl closer, sharper, edged with warning. She pushed the blanket aside and crept to the window. The frost on the glass softened everything beyond it, but she could still make out the shape of the corral. The horses stamped nervously, breath pluming in frantic bursts. A sudden thud sounded from outside. The barn door slammed once, hard. Eve's throat tightened. She slipped from the window and shook Callum's shoulder lightly. "Callum, something's out there." He woke instantly, no grogginess, no questions, just swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for the rifle propped nearby. "Stay inside," he said quietly, "no matter what you hear." Eve didn't promise. She just watched as he pulled on his coat, hat, and stepped into the storm. The wind swallowed him whole. Eve moved to the window again, breath fogging the cold glass. She couldn't see much, just the faint glow of the barn lantern and the restless shadows of horses. Minutes passed. Too many. Then a darker shape crossed the lantern light. A man. Not Callum. Boot tracks, Callum would see them. But Eve saw something else, a second shadow on the far edge of the yard. Then a third, nearer the shed. They moved like wolves, testing a fence line. A whisper drifted through the storm. Her name, Eve. Her knees buckled. She pressed a fist to her mouth. Eve Mercer. Voices low. Hunting, familiar in the worst possible way. One came right up to the window. She didn't see a face, only the blur of a hat brim and the suggestion of a grin she felt more than saw. "Give it up. Girl." Eve stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The sound exploded in the quiet cabin. Outside, a shout echoed from the barn. Callum's voice, sharp, warning. Then gunfire cracked. The horses screamed. Eve lunged for the door, only to stop when a tongue of orange light flared outside. The haystack near the corral had caught fire, snow sizzling as flames licked upward. A diversion. They wanted Callum out in the open. Her fingers shook as she grabbed the cold metal of the spare revolver on the mantel. She didn't know how to fire it well, but she'd rather die with it in her hand than sit still. More gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit the storm, brief white sparks swallowed by darkness. Shadows darted between cottonwoods, fast and deliberate. Callum, she whispered, but the wind carried the name away. She pushed the door open, cold, slapping her full in the face. Snow stung her skin like needles, but she kept moving, boots sinking deep. Near the corral, Callum fired from behind the water trough. Two shapes answered from the tree line. One moved to flank him. No, she breathed. Without thinking, Eve fired one shot at the shape moving in the dark. The recoil nearly knocked the gun from her hands. The bullet went wide, but the shooter ducked, startled. It bought Callum a heartbeat. He took it. A single crack split the night, and the man fell into the snow with a cry. The other attackers cursed, retreating toward the trees. One shouted through the storm, voice echoing off the frozen ridge, "Give us the girl and the books, Hayes, or we turn Broken Mesa into a graveyard." Eve's breath froze midair. Callum fired a warning shot after them, but they were already gone, shadows swallowed by storm and night. The fire on the haystack crackled, fighting the snow. Callum kicked snow over it until the flames hissed, shrank, and died. Silence returned slowly. Not peace, just the absence of sound. Eve lowered the revolver, arm trembling. "Callum, I didn't mean to come out. But they..." He strode toward her, snow coating his coat, face carved in grim lines. "You shouldn't have left the cabin. I heard my name." "That was the point," he said sharply. "To draw you out." A gust of wind pushed them both slightly off balance. For a moment, they stood in the swirling snow, chests rising and falling with the aftershock of what almost happened. Then Eve's voice cracked. "They'll kill people. In town. Because of me." Callum shook his head. "Eve, no," she said, stepping back. "If I stay, more men will come. They won't stop. They'll burn this ranch, or Broken Mesa, or whatever they have to." "I can't," her breath hitched. "I won't be the reason families lose their homes. I'll leave at first light. I'll ride away. Far. They'll follow me, not you." The snow fell silently between them. Callum's jaw set in a way she'd only seen once on the day he told her about the family he couldn't drag from their cabin. That same unyielding line returned now. "You run alone," he said, voice a steady rumble. "They'll kill you by noon. I'd rather that than the alternative." "No," he said again, stepping closer. "You're not dying for them, and I'm not letting you die for me." Eve opened her mouth to argue, but Callum cut her off with a firmness that made her breath stop. "We face this together." The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, as though trying to bury the danger that lingered between the trees. But the threat wasn't gone, and they both knew it. Eve lowered her gaze, snow collecting in her hair, fear and gratitude tangling in her chest so tightly she couldn't speak. Callum turned toward the cabin. "We'll plan at dawn," he said quietly. "Tonight, we stay alive." Eve watched him walk ahead, lantern light catching the edges of his coat as he disappeared into the swirling white. Her hands still trembled around the cold metal of the revolver. Together, the word lodged, deep sharp, impossible, dangerous, and warm. Dawn broke pale and thin as if the sky itself was still bruised from the gunfire the night before. Callum saddled the horses without a word. Eve, wrapped in her heaviest shawl, climbed up behind him. The snow crunched under hoofbeats, each step a slow drumbeat toward town. St. Agnes Chapel stood at the far edge of Broken Mesa, its whitewashed boards already fading under winter's wear. Frost rimmed the windows. The bell rope swung lightly in the morning wind, brushing the chapel wall like a restless hand. Inside, the air was warmer barely. The smell of beeswax and cedar lingered. Candles burned low near the altar, their flames bending from the draft under the door. A few women knelt in the front pews, whispering prayers for husbands working in far-off mines, rail camps, and cattle drives. Reverend Cole stood near the pulpit, shoulders stooped, face lined from too many funerals and not enough justice. When he saw Callum, he nodded with quiet recognition. When he saw Eve thin, pale, eyes shadowed by nights without peace, he nodded differently, with concern. "What brings you here so early?" he asked. Callum glanced toward Eve. She held the small ledger box tightly, almost protectively, as though it could anchor her. He waited, letting her speak if she chose. Her voice trembled at first. "Father, I need guidance, maybe help, maybe." She swallowed. "Maybe forgiveness." Reverend Cole gestured gently for her to sit. She did, settling on the first pew, box balanced on her lap. "What burden do you carry?" Child Eve opened the box. Inside lay the ledgers, the copied pages, the neat columns, the numbers she once believed were harmless. She lifted the top ledger and set it on the pew between them. "These books," she whispered, "show everything Copper Star Mining has done. The fake debts, the stolen wages, the poisoned wells, and the families who got sick because of it." The Reverend's eyes darkened, scanning a page with slow, deliberate care. "This is more than dishonesty," he murmured. "This is murder." Eve pressed her hands together to keep them from shaking. "People died," she said. "Not all at once. Slowly, quietly, and I balanced their books. I kept the numbers straight while families starved." Reverend Cole looked at her, not with condemnation, but with a grief that cut deeper. "You also tried to stop them, and you paid for it." Eve didn't answer. She looked down, as though afraid he'd see every mistake she'd ever made. The Reverend sighed. "Broken Mesa's law is thin right now. Sheriff Boone barely controls his own desk, much less a mining company with money to spare. But Fort Kearney," he folded his hands, "the army might listen." Callum nodded. "Then that's where we're going." Fort Kearney outpost lay a half-mile past town, a squat cluster of log buildings surrounded by a low wall. Blue uniforms moved like tired shadows across the grounds. A pair of sentries leaned on rifles, their breaths fogging the cold morning air. Inside the main office, Captain Leland Pierce sat behind a cluttered desk. He was younger than Callum expected, late 30s, clean-shaven, crisp uniform, but with eyes that hinted at long nights and too many reports written by lamplight. He offered seats. Callum took one. Eve remained standing. "What brings you here?" Captain Pierce asked. Eve placed the ledger box on the desk. "Sir," she began, voice barely above a breath, "I have proof of crimes committed by Copper Star Mining." Pierce raised a brow. "Mining companies commit a great many sins, miss, most of them legal. These weren't," she said. She opened the book, flipping to the pages that showed falsified figures, forged signatures, water shipments diverted from clean sources to contaminated ones. Pierce leaned in, expression sharpening. "If these are genuine, Copper stars in violation of federal contracts? They are genuine, Eve whispered. I copied them myself. And why come to me? Because the sheriff won't help, Callum said. He twitches when he hears the company's name, either scared or paid. Pierce didn't deny it. Instead, he folded his hands. Miss Mercer, the Army's orders are clear. Keep peace, protect the roads, maintain supply lines. Copper Star funds part of those supply trains. If I oppose them without cause, I'll be relieved of command before sunset. Eve's heart dropped. Pierce continued. But if these ledgers hold up, and if someone is willing to testify publicly, I could open an inquiry. Eve froze. Testify. Publicly. Her breath hitched. I've never spoken in front of more than 3 people. I can barely breathe when someone raises their voice at me. How do you expect me to stand in front of a crowd, men with guns? Men who hate what I know and accuse them. Truth requires witnesses, Pierce said, not just paper. Eve stared at the floor. Callum shifted, leaning forward slightly. She won't be standing alone. Pierce looked at him. And who are you to her? Callum breathed out slowly. Someone who knows what it's like to face the wrong side of the law. He hesitated. I'm a former ranger. Pierce's expression tightened respect, flickering with suspicion. You left the Rangers, walked away, Callum said, from an order I wouldn't carry out. That gave Pierce pause. A man who'd say that was either a coward or a man with a spine of iron. Pierce studied him carefully, weighing the difference. Captain, Callum said, I'll stand with her, speak with her, face whatever comes. Eve swallowed hard. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Pierce leaned back. All right. Bring me more. Bring witnesses, if you can. Letters. Anything that cannot be burned or bribed away. You get me that? His jaw set. And I'll put Copper Star under the lantern. The room went quiet. Outside, the fort bell tolled the hour, echoing across the cold yard. Eve felt her heartbeat trip over itself. The idea of testifying the thought of standing tall in front of the very men who'd hunted her made her vision blur. But Callum met her eyes. Steady. Unshaken. We'll gather what's needed, he said. And Eve, Pierce added, voice softer but colder. Be prepared. If this goes wrong, you won't just be hunted. You'll be marked. Eve's fingers clenched around the edge of the ledger. She already knew that, but hearing it aloud made her knees weaken. Callum stood slowly, a quiet mountain rising beside her. We best get moving. Eve nodded, though her breath trembled. The door opened to the cold. The world outside hadn't changed, but she had, and the fear she carried now had a name, a face, and a courtroom waiting. News traveled faster than horses in Broken Mesa. By the time Callum and Eve rode back from Fort Kearny, whispers were already drifting through the boardwalks like dust carried on a late afternoon wind. Doors cracked open as they passed. Men leaned out from saloon porches. Women paused in sweeping, staring just a little too long. No one asked questions outright, but everyone knew something. Copper Star, someone murmured behind a shutter. Ledger books, another said near the blacksmith's yard. A woman who ran. A third whispered, voice trembling with a mix of hope and dread. Broken Mesa wasn't a big town, but it was a town that listened. They stopped first at the Dust Lantern Saloon because Callum needed to check the notice board for supply deliveries. As soon as they stepped inside, conversation faltered. The piano clanked to a halt mid-song. A bartender paused in wiping a glass. 4 miners gathered at a card table stared openly at Eve. One of them, thin, gray at the temples. Coughing in long, tearing bursts spoke first. "You're the bookwoman," he rasped. Eve's heart thudded. I kept records for the company." Another miner leaned back in his chair. "Heard you got proof. They been cheatin' folks." Callum's tone sharpened. "That's enough." But the man raised a hand, shaking his head. "Nah. Let her speak if she wants." Eve swallowed hard. Copper Star hid wages and charged debts that weren't real. She hesitated. And the water upstream. It wasn't clean. They knew. The coughing miner's eyes went soft. "My boy's been sick since August," he whispered, never knew why. Eve's stomach twisted. She lowered her gaze. "Folks'll want answers," the man added. "This town's been held under a boot too long." But across the room, another voice cut through the murmur. "And answers get people killed." A thick-set rancher stared Eve down. His jaw worked slowly, like chewing on something bitter. "You stir up Copper Star. You put targets on all our backs." Callum took a step forward, but Eve lightly touched his sleeve. Her breathing hitched. The room felt too small, too hot, too judgmental. They left without buying anything. Next stop was Riley's forge. Sparks flew from the anvil as Riley struck a red-hot piece of iron, sending bright arcs into the winter air. A miner stood nearby, waiting, his breath wheezing in short, painful bursts. When he saw Eve, he removed his hat respectfully. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't hold no anger toward you. Just a question." His shoulders sagged. "If the army comes for Copper Star, will they do right by us?" Eve didn't know. She wished she did. He coughed again. A deep, rattling sound that bent him nearly in half. "Just sharpen the pick. Riley, just in case." Riley's hammer paused. "In case of what?" he asked. The miner spat blood-tinged spit into the snow. "In case talk don't fix a damn thing." At the far end of town, Sheriff Boone stood on the boardwalk adjusting his badge. Callum approached him, hoping for some sliver of cooperation. Boone didn't let him speak first. "You're stirring up hornets." "Hayes," he said. "Copper Star ain't gonna let some ledger girl ruin their profits." Eve stiffened. "Ledger girl," Boone continued, voice low, twitchy. "She's safer if she rides on. So are the rest of us." Callum stepped in close enough that Boone flinched. "You try to run her out, and you'll answer to me." Boone swallowed, eyes shifting. "Just think about what you're asking. Town's on thin ice as it is." Callum didn't answer. He just turned back toward the wagon, jaw set. They entered Harding's general store for flour and lamp oil. Eve stayed near the door, hoping to go unnoticed, but a woman stepped out from behind a crate of canned peaches, face drawn tight with grief. Her coat was patched, her eyes bloodshot. "You," the woman said. Eve froze. "Ma'am." The widow stared hard at her hands, trembling, breath sharp. "My husband died last spring," she said, voice brittle. "Shaft collapse at Copper Star. They said it was his fault, said he'd been careless." A beat of silence. "Your books," the widow whispered. "Would they show the truth? Would they show the company, cut corners, and saved money instead of lives?" Eve's mouth went dry. I don't know. Some entries. Maybe I didn't see it all. I wasn't allowed into the mine ledgers." The widow's face twisted. "So why didn't you speak sooner? Why didn't you warn anyone before men died?" The question slammed into Eve like a blow. She tried to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. Shame rose like a tide old, familiar, corrosive. She backed away, eyes stinging. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The woman didn't stop her. She just turned away, shoulders shaking. Callum finished the purchase quickly. They left without speaking. The ride back to Hayes Ranch was silent. The sky hung low, gray and heavy, as though pressing down on the entire valley. Eve kept her gaze fixed on the distant ridge, trying to breathe steadily, but the widow's words echoed over and over. Why didn't you speak sooner? Why didn't you warn anyone? By the time they reached the porch, her legs felt weak. Callum tied the horses, then found her standing stiff near the railing, gripping it until her knuckles ached. He didn't approach too quickly. He knew better than to startle someone already frayed. "Eve," he said quietly, "look at me." She didn't. He took one step closer. "You're carrying every sin that company committed, as if you caused them yourself." She closed her eyes. Maybe I did. Maybe if I'd run sooner, spoken sooner, if I'd been braver. Callum cut her off gently. "If you stand up now, some folks will curse you." Eve lifted her eyes. They glistened in the pale evening light. "But," Callum continued, voice softer than she'd ever heard it, "some will have a fightin' chance for the first time." The wind rustled across the porch, carrying dust and the faint scent of distant snow. "You don't owe them your life," Callum said, "but you might choose to give them your voice." Eve inhaled shakily. "And if my voice puts you in danger," Callum shrugged lightly, but his eyes were unwavering, "then I'll face that danger same as I'd face a storm. Upright, with purpose." Eve pressed a hand over her heart, feeling its uneven beat. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It wasn't just survival. It was justice raw, ugly, necessary, for the sick miner, for the dead husband, for the children drinking bad water, for the men and women whose names never made it into any ledger. She finally whispered. Then, "I'll stand." Callum's breath left him slowly, as if he'd been waiting for that answer. The porch remained quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like the place where a storm would gather its strength. Snow tapped against the cabin windows like small, persistent fingers. The storm had passed, leaving the world white and muted. But inside Hayes Ranch, the air was thick-heavy with something neither of them had spoken aloud. Callum cleared the kitchen table, sweeping aside rope pieces, a horseshoe he meant to repair, and a half-read copy of the Wyoming Tribune. He set down the box of ledgers with care, as though the wood itself were fragile. Eve sat across from him, hands folded tightly in her lap. A candle flickered between them, the flame trembling whenever she exhaled. "We'll go through it one more time," Callum said. "Before we take anything to Captain Pierce," Eve nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. Callum opened the top ledger. The pages smelled faintly of smoke and old ink, of months buried in a wagon, of hands trembling as they were copied. He slid the book toward her. "Tell me where to start." Eve flipped slowly through pages worn soft from handling. The margins were filled with her tidy handwriting notes, corrections, small stars marking discrepancies she'd found. The neatness of it made her chest ache. She had once taken pride in this precision. "Here," she said softly, tapping a sheet near the center. "Payroll changes. See the totals. They don't match the daily logs." Callum leaned in, squinting at the tiny, perfect numbers. Eve continued. "Copper Star used these adjustments to dock wages. They blamed miners for debt they never owed." Callum frowned, and nobody questioned it. "Miners can't read half the time," she whispered. "And the ones who could, well, the company had ways to quiet them." She turned to another page. "These are deductions for the company store. They doubled prices whenever they felt like it, and wrote off the debt as if it were the miner's fault. Damn. Callum muttered under his breath. Eve kept turning pages, her fingers stiff and cold despite the warm room. Then she stopped. A name caught her eye, her own. She froze. The candle flickered and steadied, but the world around her tilted ever so slightly. Callum noticed the change in her shoulders. Eve. Her breath stuttered. No, no, that can't. She dragged the ledger closer until it nearly touched her chest. At the bottom of a payroll adjustment page, one of the worst, one that had cost families half their earnings in a single month, was a signature. Her signature? Eveline Mercer. Ink neat, confident, unmistakable. A cold rush passed through her. She flipped to the next page, hands shaking, another signature. Then another, and another at the bottom of a land seizure order allowing Copper Star to temporarily occupy a water source 8 miles south of Red Bluff. She felt her heartbeat like a hammer in her ribs. No, she said, voice breaking. No. This wasn't. Callum leaned forward, brows furrowed. Let me see. But Eve jerked the ledger back instinctively, as though he might see too much. It was my hand, she whispered. My ink. Her voice shrilled. Raw. I wrote these. I signed these orders. I didn't know, but the ink is mine. Her breath hitched. The water rights, the land seizures, the false debts. I signed them all. They told me they were routine reports, payroll updates, shipment authorizations. I didn't ask questions. I thought. Her voice cracked on the edge of a sob. I thought I was doing good work. She clutched her own fingers, staring at the faint stains of ink still embedded around her nails, proof of the life she once lived. My careful work, she whispered, horrified, became the knife. Callum opened his mouth, but she kept going, words tumbling out like broken glass. I helped them, she cried softly. God help me, I helped them. Every column I balanced, every line I tidied, it all looked so clean. But it was poison. I was the one who made their lies look real. Tears fell onto the ledger page, darkening the edges of her signature. Callum didn't move. He just watched her with a depth she couldn't meet. I'm no better than the men who hunted me, she choked out. Maybe worse. I didn't have a gun, but I signed the papers that killed families just as surely as if I'd pulled a trigger. She bowed her head into her hands, shoulders shaking. For a long moment, the only sound was her quiet, breaking breath. Then Callum stood and walked around the table, not hastily, not loudly, just steady, deliberate steps. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat. Eve, he said softly, give me your hands. She stiffened. No, you don't understand. If you knew, I do know. He took her hands anyway. Her fingers were cold, stained faint gray-blue, where ink had soaked into the creases of her skin. He held them gently, between his own rough palms, hands, scarred from rope burns, from rains, from a rifle he once carried in a life he'd tried to bury. You signed what they told you was the truth, he said quietly. Those papers might have had your name, but the lies on them belonged to the men who wrote the orders, not the woman they paid to write it down. Eve shook her head. But I should have known. I should have questioned, and I should have refused to drag families out of their homes. Callum cut in, voice low. But I didn't. Not right away. Took time before I saw the wrong I was part of. She looked up slowly, eyes red, searching his face. I carried that guilt alone for years. He continued, but guilt ain't meant to bury you. It's meant to teach you how to stand different next time. Her breath trembled. The harm Copper Star caused, he said, that's on them, not on the pen they made you hold. The words struck something deep, something raw and wounded. She inhaled shakily. Callum, I don't know how to forgive myself. You ain't gonna do it in one night. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, but you don't have to do it alone. The cabin felt warmer than not from the stove, but from something else. Something quiet and steady, like the way snow settles on fences after a storm. Eve looked at her signature again, no longer clean, no longer perfect, but no longer a noose tightening around her throat. She closed the ledger slowly, and for the first time since she'd fled Red Bluff, she felt like she might be able to breathe around the truth. Snow still clung to the church steps that afternoon, mounded along the edges where boots had packed it down. Agnes Chapel had never held so many people at once. Horses lined the hitching rails. Wagons cluttered the narrow street. Voices rose in anxious waves, bouncing off the chapel walls like thunder gathering before a storm. Inside, the heat from bodies alone made the air thick. Candles flickered along the altar rail. Every pew was filled, miners, in patched coats, widows in dark shawls, ranchers with wind-burned faces, saloon girls standing in the back with arms folded tightly against their ribs. Even a handful of soldiers from Fort Kearny were there, rifles stacked neatly in the corner. Captain Pierce stood near the front with Reverend Cole. Their expressions were grave. Callum and Eve stepped inside together. The room went quiet, not a heavy silence, more like a held breath. The sound of boots shifting on the wood floor, someone clearing a throat, someone else whispering a warning to stay civil. Near the front pew sat Mr. Dalton, Copper Star's local representative. He wore a fine coat, boots shined, hair slicked back. 2 hired guns flanked him, broad men with cold eyes scanning the room. Reverend Cole raised a hand. Folks, we gathered today for truth, nothing less. A murmur rippled through the chapel. Captain Pierce spoke next. We'll hear testimony, we'll keep order, and we won't be intimidated. His gaze landed squarely on Dalton's men. Dalton smiled tightly, as though he owned the very air he breathed. Reverend Cole turned to Eve. Miss Mercer, you may speak. Eve's feet felt nailed to the floor. Her breath trembled. Her palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. Callum leaned in just enough for her to feel his presence. You're not alone, he whispered. She nodded once, then stepped forward. The chapel seemed to tilt around her. For a moment, she couldn't find her voice at all. Just the weight of every eye in the room pressing on her ribs. Then she opened the ledger. My name is Eveline Mercer, she began, voice thin. I kept the books for Copper Star Mining. A few miners in the front row leaned forward. I saw things I didn't understand at the time. She continued. Wages didn't match ours. Debts were doubled. Prices changed when the foreman felt like it. She swallowed. Families were charged for water that wasn't clean. A cough echoed from the back, a familiar, deep, tearing cough. Men got sick. Eve said, children, too. Livestock died. I thought it was coincidence. I thought the numbers were just mistakes. Her voice shook. But they weren't mistakes. They were lies. Lies written by the company. Lies I was told to copy. Whispers erupted. Widows exchanged looks. Miners clenched fists. Dalton rose smoothly. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, smiling like a fox, this is a hysterical woman who doesn't understand business. She falsified these ledgers and now seeks to blame the company for her own errors. A few heads turned sharply. Tension spiked. Callum stepped forward before Eve could react. She ain't hysterical, he said. voice steady as hammered iron, and she damn sure knows business better than any man who hides behind hired guns. Dalton's eyes thinned. And who are you to speak on company affairs? Callum straightened. Callum Hayes, former ranger. A murmur rippled through the chapel. He continued, louder. I followed orders once, orders that hurt good people. Took me too long to see the wrong of it. His jaw tightened. But I walked away. And I won't stand aside again while folks get bled dry for profit. The room vibrated with something dangerous, truth breaking open. Eve's breath steadied as Callum stepped beside her. Captain Pierce unfolded several sheets of his own. My scouts examined Copper Star's claims. Found dead cattle near Poison Creek. Found sick children at the fort. Children who drank water hauled from upstream. He tossed a vial of murky water onto the table. Ooh. This is what Copper Star's been selling. Dalton's face twitched. Only slightly. But enough? Pierce nodded at Eve. Her ledgers match what we found. Whispers turned into a rumble. Dalton snapped. This is outrageous. Copper Star is the backbone of this region. You shut us down. You starved this town. A widow in the second row stood. My husband starved before he died. She said, voice trembling with fury. Don't you speak of sacrifice. A miner stood next. We've been working ourselves into the ground while you buy lawmen and whiskey. Another rose. My boy coughs blood. Blood. You tell me that's coincidence. Dalton's face contorted not with fear, but with arrogance. You people don't understand. Mining requires risk. Some will die. It's the cost of progress. It's the cost of business. The room fell ice cold. Reverend Cole whispered, Lord, forgive us. Dalton straightened, voice rising. Copper Star cannot be held accountable for every unfortunate loss. Callum took one step forward. Dalton sneered. You think you can stop us? We could let a few die and still claim he cut himself off too late. Silence. Every man, every woman, every soldier heard it. We could let a few die. Captain Pierce stepped forward, sharply. Mr. Dalton, by authority of the United States Army, you're going to answer for that statement. Dalton's hand twitched toward his coat. Two soldiers leveled rifles instantly. The hired guns froze. The chapel erupted not in panic, but in the kind of righteous fury that could topple an empire. Miners stood. We're done working your shafts. Women stepped forward. You'll pay for our dead. Riley Dunn raised his voice from the back. Broken Mesa ain't owned by Copper Star. Captain Pierce nodded to his men. Take Dalton into custody. Hold him pending federal inquiry. Dalton's bravado cracked. He tried to protest, but the soldiers bound his hands and marched him out of the chapel. As the tension broke, the room swayed. Eve's knees gave out. Callum caught her before she hit the floor third time. Same steadiness. It's over, she whispered, though she didn't believe it fully. Not yet, Callum murmured. But today we turn the tide. Eve clung to his coat, breath uneven, tears slipping down her cheeks from relief and exhaustion. Behind them, the townsfolk finally breathed, and for the first time, Broken Mesa breathed with them. By the time the spring winds came back around, Copper Star's wagons had stopped rolling through Broken Mesa. The big company sign over their office door came down one gray morning. Pried off with a crowbar while half the town watched, investigators from back east were on their way, or so the telegraph lines claimed. Men in suits, papers in their hands instead of guns. Folks muttered that it was too little, too late, but even small justice was still justice. Broken Mesa was bruised, but breathing easier. At Riley's Forge, the sound of hammer on anvil rang longer each day. Not for Copper Star tools anymore, but for wagon repairs, plow blades, and odd jobs that had been put off for years. Riley grinned. More, cursed less. The cough in his chest rattled the same, but now he spat in the dirt with defiance, not defeat. The Dust Lantern saloon was quieter at night. The piano still played, but the songs sounded different, less angry, more thoughtful. Men leaned over tables with maps spread out, talking about irrigation ditches and new wells, about hauling fresh water from honest sources. Fights still broke out now, and then this was still the West, but more often than not. Someone stepped between fists and said, "We've bled enough." At St. Agnes Chapel, Reverend Cole lit candles for men whose names were finally spoken aloud without shame. Widows sat in the front pews with heads held higher, knowing the world now knew how their husbands really died. Out on Hayes Ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. Eve woke most mornings to the smell of coffee and the sound of Callum moving about the barn. The nightmares still came shadows at the window, wagon wheels burning, men's voices sneering in the dark, but they weren't every night now. Some nights passed in simple, dreamless sleep. That felt like a miracle, all by itself. Her body still carried old alarms. Sudden loud noises made her flinch. A slammed door, a dropped pan, the crack of a splitting log. Each one sent a jolt through her spine before she could remind herself she was safe. Callum always paused when that happened, giving her a moment, never making a show of it. If it bothered him, he never said. What bothered him more, perhaps, was the way she threw herself back into work the first chance she got. She cooked for him, for neighbors, for anyone passing by. She mended his shirts before he even noticed they'd torn. She started making ledgers again this time for townsfolk who needed help with their accounts. She set up a little corner of the table with ink and paper, offering to check figures for fair pay and honest trade. It wasn't Copper Star, it wasn't lies, but it was work. You don't have to keep everyone's books, Callum said one evening, watching her rub at an ink stain on her fingers. I like numbers, she replied. They sit still. People. Don't. He'd smiled at that, but there was worry in it. One cold afternoon, with the sky the color of tin and a wind that cut straight through wool, Eve slipped out to mend the fence line. Callum had mentioned a sagging section on the north side of the property. He hadn't asked her to fix it. He'd planned to ride out himself later in the week, but work called to her like an old habit. She bundled herself in coat and scarf, stuffed pliers and wire into a canvas bag, and walked the fence instead of saddling a horse. One post after another, she checked knots, pulled slack wire tight, wrestling with rusted staples and stubborn wood. The cold bit deep into her fingers. She ignored it. By the time she reached halfway down the line, the wind had picked up, slicing through her coat. Her breath came shorter, frosting the air in quick bursts. Her hands were raw from the wire, tiny cuts stinging when the wind found them. She told herself she just needed to finish this section. Then she'd rest. Then she'd go back. She kept telling herself that until the pliers slipped from her numb fingers, they dropped into the snow with a soft thud. Eve braced a hand on the fence post, breathing hard. The world swam a little around the edges. Her legs felt heavier than they should, like she'd walked 10 miles. Not 2. You planning to mend the whole territory by yourself, she turned. Callum stood a few yards behind her, hat pulled low against the wind, coat buttoned high. She hadn't heard him approach, too caught up in numbers that weren't on any page. I was just... She bent to reach for the pliers, but he was already there, picking them up from the snow. "You're shaken," he said. "It's just the wind." She replied, "I needed to be useful." The words came out too fast, too sharp, betraying more than she meant to. Callum studied her for a long second, not judging, just seeing. He held out a gloved hand. "Come on, I can finish this section," she protested weakly. "It's only a few more posts. I'm fine." "You're breathing like you ran from here to Fort Kearney," he said. "That's not fine." She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Her chest ached. Her fingers had gone past stinging to a dull, dangerous numbness. The last few days had left her sleep thin and fractured. "I just needed to be useful," she said again, more quietly, without the ledgers, without the hearings, just doing something that didn't hurt anyone. Callum's expression softened. He took the pliers from her hand, slipped them into his belt, and guided her toward the fence. With a gentle push, he helped her sit on the wide, flat top of a corner post where the boards met, high enough to rest, low enough not to fall. "Sit," he said. "That's an order." She huffed a breath that might have been a laugh if she weren't so tired. He leaned against the rail beside her, his shoulder close but not pressing. The wind tugged at their coats, but from up on the line, the view stretched long over the white fields, the dark dots of cattle, the distant smudge of broken mesa. "You already did the hardest work I know, Eve," he said quietly. She stared at the ground. "Mending fences, tellin' the truth," he replied, "when it cost you nearly everything." Her throat tightened. He kept his gaze on the horizon. "You don't have to keep proving you deserve to sit down." The words sank deeper than the cold ever could. Eve swallowed. "I've spent so long earning every bite of food, every roof overhead. I don't know how to just take it." "Then you learn," he said. "Same way a wild horse learns not every hand means a rope." She turned her head, studying him. "And if I never quite get there," he finally looked at her, eyes warm beneath the brim of his hat, "then I'll remind you. As many times as it takes." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not empty this time, full of everything they didn't need to say out loud. The wind eased. Eve let her shoulders drop just a little, let her hands rest open on her lap, not reaching for tools, not trying to grip anything at all. For the first time, sitting still didn't feel like a crime. It felt like a small, hard-won right. Callum shifted, then hopped up to sit on the rail beside her. Boots hooked on the lower board, shoulder brushing hers, and staying there. Together. They looked out over the land they were slowly, quietly, turning into something worth keeping. Eve breathed in deep, the cold air clearing more than it hurt. For a brief, fragile moment, she allowed herself to believe that not every day had to be earned in sweat and fear. Some days could simply be lived. 15 years slid by, the way seasons do on the high plains quietly, then all at once. Hayes Ranch didn't turn rich or grand. It just grew steady, the way good things tend to. An extra corral added to the east side, a small bunkhouse repaired plank by plank until it became something gentler. Warm beds for widows passing through, children needing shelter for a winter or a week. The herd grew. The fences held. The roof leaked less with every spring. Broken Mesa changed too. The Poison Creek ran clean again. Years of silt and snowmelt, washing away what Copper Star left behind. A new schoolhouse stood beside St. Agnes Chapel. Built with lumber raised by the townsfolk, one beam at a time. The well on the north edge became a gathering place, women filling metal buckets, boys daring each other to touch the icy water. The Dust Lantern Saloon still played piano most nights, but the songs carried laughter instead of anger now. Riley's forge hammered on, though Riley limped more these days. Folks said the forge's heat kept his lungs alive through winter. Time had its say on everyone. Eve, now in her 40s, carried silver streaks in her dark hair, threads of winter woven through autumn. She wore glasses sometimes for close work, muttering that numbers went blurry quicker than they used to. But her eyes were sharper, clearer, lighter than they'd ever been in her youth. The tightness that once lived around her mouth had eased. She smiled more. She slept deeper. She still kept ledgers, only honest ones now, for neighbors, for the school, for the chapel fund, but she closed them at sundown, something the woman she once was could never have imagined. Callum aged too. His hair had gone iron gray. His limp, once barely noticeable, now showed on cold mornings. The lines on his face deepened, but so did the warmth in his eyes. He'd become something of an anchor to the town, quiet, steady, the man folks sought when trouble stirred, but most evenings found him in the same place, the porch. And tonight was no different. The sun slid low across the horizon, painting the high plains in gold that softened into violet. The air was warm with the day's leftover heat, cool at the edges just enough to remind them summer was rounding its final corner. Eve stepped out with 2 tin cups of coffee. She handed one to Callum before settling beside him in the old rocking chair he'd rebuilt twice now. Children's laughter drifted from the bunkhouse, 3 little ones staying until their aunt arrived from Cheyenne. Their joy carried across the yard like wind chimes. Callum sipped his coffee, then let out a contented hum. Good roast tonight. Eve smiled. That's because you didn't make it. He chuckled, deep and warm. I recall you saying something about being too old to be polite. She murmured, leaning back, but not too old to be honest. Silence settled between them, not empty, but familiar. The sort of silence 2 people earn after years of shared mornings, shared chores, shared fears, shared warmth. The sky shifted from gold to rose, then to a deep, slow purple. Eve watched it for a long moment before speaking. I remember the smoke, she said softly, the wagon, the cold dirt, and the only words I could think to say. She swallowed a breath. Please, I can work. Callum didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. He just listened, letting each word settle like dust on a windowsill. I spent half my life thinking rest was a sin unless I'd earned it triple, Eve whispered. Believing stillness meant weakness, that if I wasn't proving myself, I was in danger of being thrown away. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Though the evening wasn't cold, for so long, work was the only version of worth I knew. Callum's cup clicked softly as he set it beside his boot. Then he looked over at her with that slow, rare smile, the one he used only when he wanted her to truly hear him. You've paid every debt any fair man could name, he said, and a few heaven never asked of you. Eve's breath caught in her chest, gentle, not painful. Beyond them, the children's laughter faded as they were ushered inside. A lantern flickered to life in the bunkhouse window. The horses settled in their stalls. The wind softened across the ridge. Callum leaned back, letting his shoulder brush hers. Just a touch. Enough to remind her of every year he'd stayed. Every year she'd learned slowly, cautiously, that she didn't have to earn each breath. Not anymore. Eve lifted her eyes to the sky, now deepening into night, stars peeking through like shy sparks. Funny, she murmured. When I was young, I worked myself half dead for men who didn't even know my name. And now? She looked at him fully. I rest beside a man who knows everything about me and still chooses to stay. Callum's voice, low and warm, carried the weight of a lifetime behind it. I'd do it all again. Eve smiled the soft, tired, grateful smile of a woman who had learned to love the days she didn't have to earn. The wind shifted, lifting a strand of silvered hair from her cheek. The porch boards creaked under their boots as the dusk settled into its final quiet. And in that silence, the narrator of the West might have said, on a hard piece of earth, under a harder sky, a woman who thought she had to work for every breath finally learned how to sit still, not because a man allowed it, but because someone finally stayed long enough to tell her she didn't have to earn her own worth. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, on a quiet porch, in the arms of a stranger, or in the simple mercy of someone who chooses to stay. Eve spent half her life believing she had to earn every breath she took, trading rest for fear and work for worth. But the West has a way of teaching us gently, even through its storms, that a soul isn't measured by how much it produces, but by how much it survives, and how much it dares to hope again. And Callum steady. Weathered Callum reminds us of something else, that standing with someone is its own kind of courage, that a kind voice, a patient presence, can turn a burned-out life into a place where roots might finally grow. Maybe that's the lesson tucked between the gun smoke and winter winds, that none of us were meant to walk the hardest miles alone. And sometimes, the quietest act, offering a place to rest, can save a life more surely than any fight ever could. If this story found a soft place in you, hold that feeling close. You deserve rest too. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening with an open heart, and for walking these quiet miles across the Old West alongside our characters. Your presence here means more than you know. Every like, every share, every subscribe isn't just support for the channel. It's a way of keeping compassion alive, of helping stories like this reach someone who might need a soft place to land tonight. Thank you for being here with us. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul.